Hey friends, my name is Keith Ferguson. I'm the lead pastor at Cityview Bible Church here in Round Rock, Texas. And in the midst of this difficult time for our nation and for the world, I've brought together some of my good friends who are pastors here in Round Rock, and we just are all part of the Big C Church. We love our city. We love what God's doing in our community. Come together today to really have a roundtable discussion around race in the church and race in the United States. And some of what we're learning, what God's teaching us. These are hard conversations. There's a lot of raw emotion around this, and you're going to feel that today as we talk about it. But I think we want to model for everybody kind of how do you have a meaningful, healthy conversation between people who love each other about a hard topic and do it in a good way. And so hopefully some of what you hear today is helpful to you, encouraging to you, gives you a little bit of vision of where to go from here, because I think a lot of people are feeling just a lot of emotion, but not knowing what to do with it or how to direct it. And so as we get into this conversation, I want to introduce these three gentlemen to my left and tell you who they are, about their families and their churches that they lead. In addition to that, I just want to say kind of at the outset, we can hold multiple convictions and things that we believe in tension at the same time. And so what we're going to talk about, focus our discussions on today, is primarily around race and race relationships, like I said, within the church and within the country. And at the same time, we can look out around what's happening in our country and say, hey, we are supportive of these peaceful protesters who are making their voices heard in a major way right now. And at the same time, we can say we don't support the rioting and the looting and some of the violence that's happening alongside of it. But that being said, that's not the focus of this topic, is the protest and the rioting and all that. The focus of this conversation right now is specifically around race and how do we move forward in a more just community. And so I just want you to know where we're going today and kind of frame up the conversation. So that's who I am. That's what we're doing today. This is Benito Fresquez. He is the lead pastor at Freedom Church here in Round Rock, Texas, planted 2009. And Latin guy from New Mexico, moved to Texas to plant a church. And why don't you tell us, I guess as we kind of go around and introduce you, how are you doing? How's your congregation doing? How are you processing everything that's going on right now?
Keith, just like everyone, we're absolutely heartbroken and our hearts are shattered by what's going on. And we just, like you, thank you for inviting us into this conversation. And church is doing well, thank the Lord. And like you, I believe that the church is the one that leads in making these changes that need to take place and loving others and in these conversations. And but just like everyone else, I think we're just deeply grieved. I know we had services this past Sunday for the first time, and Saturday night I just couldn't go to sleep. I'm locked in and focused on the sermon for Sunday, but these things just crush my heart in 1,000 pieces. I know you feel the same way too.
Yeah. Pastor Benito leads a church that's very diverse, multiracial. I know that's a big part of your heart, your vision for why you planted Freedom Church. And I think you told me earlier you got like 25 different nationalities.
Yeah, thank the Lord. Yeah, it's
so praise God. That's a picture of heaven, man.
Yeah, one of the things we say at Freedom Church is this: if our church doesn't look like Walmart, we're not the church. We're a club. So we always got to pass the Walmart test, because that's what the community looks like, really, and the church should look like.
That's good. Pastor Michael Oyedokun, or as he makes me call him now, Pastor Dr. Michael Oyedokun, a good friend of mine here, pastor of Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church here in town in Round Rock, oldest African-American church, historically African-American church here in Round Rock, and just been a great joy to build a good friendship with Pastor O. And you guys, you brought over a good portion of your congregation. This is fresh in my mind because it's like the last memory I had before everything shut down.
That's right.
It was like the beginning of March. We had a night of prayer and worship, and your worship team and our worship team, we got together and we just made music. It was beautiful. You and I led some prayer time. And so there's just been a good relationship and friendship. And same question, just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you're doing, how's your congregation doing right now?
Thanks for having us to come, Keith, and we really appreciate the conversation. Good Hope, we're doing good. Of course, like Benito said, I think everybody's just kind of in shock and awe right now. I know for the African-American community, it's more being tired, being frustrated that yet again we have to go through something like this. And when you think that you made great strides in equality and kind of addressing the issues that we're going to talk about today, and then to kind of get knocked back. This past Sunday, I preached a sermon entitled "I Got the Wind Knocked Out of Me," and so it's kind of like we're right back to having to come together, and now it's with all of the stuff that's going on in the nation. It just seems like we need prayer, we need unity, we need solutions, so that we don't have to keep revisiting this. But I'm thankful for the members of Good Hope. We are yet continuing to press forward. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that word weary a lot this week as I've had conversations. So I hear that in your voice and in some of the things that you're saying. So thanks for sharing that. Pastor Evan Black, Faith for Life Church here in Round Rock, Texas as well, lead pastor there. I think Evan has a very interesting story because you're a white guy, or, I think Pastor O calls you a light-skinned black guy. So.
No, I'm all the way white.
But your congregation, Faith for Life, that you pastor is predominantly African-American. You're married to an African-American woman. You have mixed-race children. And so you have a very unique perspective on this as well, kind of your own story and your ministry and your family as well. So same question for you. How are you doing? How's your congregation doing?
Yeah, same as Benito and Pastor O. This is nothing new, but it's still very heartbreaking, very discouraging. Having two sons who will grow up in this country being seen as black, not being seen as interracial. Mm-hmm. These events hit me in a unique way because I grew up in a suburb that was all white. So a lot of the things that I'm responsible for teaching and leading them, it was never taught or led for me because it wasn't required. Mm-hmm. So not just with this last case of George Floyd, but just over the years now, seeing these situations, they're heartbreaking. They cause a little bit of fear, if I'm being honest, in how do I prepare my sons to live in this world, and how do I empower them to make a change. And this one has been one that's hit me the same way. It feels different. I haven't been able to shake it. I haven't been able to get past it. It's emotional. It's difficult, and it's the same for our church. Mm-hmm. I've had grown men, tough men, strong men reach out, and they're in tears. Mm-hmm. They're hurting. They're angry. They're confused. They're fighting to not be hopeless. And man, I just appreciate you gathering us to help speak into some of this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I just value y'all's voice so much, and I think part of what I've tried to practice, I think I told you guys this earlier, over this last week, is to been just a really good listener, be very empathetic. And so I think I want to encourage you, first of all, just as we are modeling this for you, and I think for many times white people who have not had racist experiences or prejudice against them can kind of hear these things, and they can struggle to hear them well, to listen and say, okay, yeah, what does that mean that happened to you? And so part of this is what I'm trying to model too, is I've listened to people within our congregation who are different races, and pastor friends I have of different races, is to try to listen well and say this is a time where we really have to grow in understanding. So I think we want to start this conversation with trying to get some definitions established, because we're going to use some words during this conversation like prejudice, racism, injustice. And I think we've all acknowledged those words can be used differently or mean different things to different people. And I think part of what I want to do is to try to help those who are watching this video or listening to this audio to kind of get some foundation under their feet of what are we talking about, because I think if you don't have clarity on what we're talking about, it's hard to know how to move forward with it. So let's start, Benito, just help us with prejudice. What is prejudice? I think you probably can share from some of your own experience of kind of what has that looked like in your life. Pastor our hearts a little bit around that word.
You know, Keith, I think there's a difference between prejudice and racism, and we're going to discuss that. But I think we all have these preconceived prejudice ideas when we walk into a room sometime. For example, I grew up in northern New Mexico, predominantly Hispanic, and then I moved to Texas, where all of a sudden I was the minority. And I remember first time going into college, and the college that I went to was about 90% Anglo. And I remember looking around and thinking, man, do these people like me? They're different. They look different. They act different. They talk different. They have different backgrounds. So whether I knew it or not, I was bringing this prejudice type of mentality and looking through that too. And then sometimes they'd call me names. Sometimes they were doing it jokingly, but it hurt at the beginning. I remember the first time I'd be called a spick. I was called a wetback. I had some friends tell me, hey, why don't you just go mow my lawn for me? And I'm like, I wanted to punch him in the face, you know, but they, right. And some people think that these terms are, it's just joking. And granted, and they will know there's some people that can, you know, that they love you and they can say that and they're just messing around. But there's some people that you want to punch them back. But I remember the first time the prejudice really where I felt it the most. I was driving in a Midwestern state, actually Missouri, and I'm from New Mexico. I had a license plates that said New Mexico plates. I had tinted windows because that's the way people, that's how we rolled. And back in the 90s, everybody, it was a generation of hip hop and Allen Iverson. So I had chains, and I had these Tommy Hilfiger shirts and these baggy pants and Nikes. And I'm just driving and then somebody comes up, sees me, and they just come up to me. I remember one time they kind of cut me off on the road. They said, I'm going to kick your butt back to the ghetto. You need to get back to where you belong. And I'm like, what is this? You know, I'm like, I've never kind of experienced that type of prejudice. And he's making decisions of me and kind of putting me down there with prejudiced ideas. And I think what I mean by prejudice is we don't need to act on those prejudices. When all of a sudden he's coming down there, he getting profiled just because I look a certain way, talk a certain way, and obviously fit a description of what quote unquote dangerous person should be. Wasn't mean I've ever been dangerous. I never dealt drugs, never even drank alcohol, those different things that they would. And so it was in those moments that I realized, Lord, I think with prejudice, it's examining your heart and saying, Lord, it's looking inwardly before I look outside, and seeing, Lord, how can I be the change within my life, and then how am I carrying these prejudices outside to other races and other people. So I would say, to me, that's how if I could define prejudice, I would say we all have them, but a prejudice doesn't lead you to a racism. It's how we control that and how we begin to understand that we can begin to evolve and grow and become better people.
Yeah, that's really helpful explaining that, and that we all do have some stereotypes or conceptions about who people are based on the way they look. And I think what I hear you saying too is it takes a level of self-awareness to know, like, what prejudice do I have? I may not even be aware of them, because they could be minor or they could be major or something in between.
And for me, I sometimes had prejudice towards maybe even the majority that was there. Right. Like I thought that they were going to treat me a certain way. Right. Some of them did and some of them didn't, but and it's hard. I had to kind of break apart all the prejudice that was in my heart, and you got to apply it to every situation and realize, okay, is this, and you just begin to trust people. I think trust is the big thing that we need, and there's some people that are trustworthy and some people that aren't, and I found that to be in all parts of life. Yeah,
that's really good. Pastor O, when you move from prejudice into this word racism, you know, and we talk about it both at like a personal level, like personal racism, and then we also hear this phrase like systemic racism or communal racism, and so that feels different than prejudice, kind of what Benito's describing. So help us understand racism at kind of the next level. Like what do we mean when we talk about racism?
I think when we talk about racism, we're describing feelings toward a certain race or a certain culture of people. And those feelings are negative, or where the value is low or the worth is low. And so what happens is is that there is the perception, and then you're carrying out these negative perceptions on a culture or a race of people based on their ethnicity, color of their skin. And so there's personal, which where their racism resides within a person and their mindset and their feelings and their actions. The systemic part of it is where the system is set up to keep a certain race or culture down, or in poverty, or not having the same equal rights as everyone else. We're all people, we're all made by God, we're all created in His image. And so when we start to look at another human being just because of where they came up, or the color of their skin, or their ethnicity, then we fall into that mode of racism. And I know that a lot of times we want to just apply it to African Americans, but racism can exist amongst all different ethnicities and cultures. The reason why it's so prominent in the African American community is because of the history of racism that we've experienced from
Here in the United States.
Here in the United States, from being brought over on slave ships. I had the opportunity going to Atlanta to the Apex Museum, where they actually showed the boats and how slaves were brought over and chained, and the conditions. And so when you see this and know that this has been happening, and we feel like as a country that we've progressed beyond that, only to find out that that mentality still exists.
Yeah.
And now with social media and what I try to label it as keyboard courage, now everyone is exposing themselves to some of their thought processes, and for some it's turning into where they're having to deal with their actions and their words. But we're seeing now that racism is not dead as we thought that it was.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. I appreciate that. I think we all agree with what you're saying. I wrote a post a little while ago kind of trying to help people understand systemic injustice, systemic racism, because I hear from a lot of white people who say, like, well, I don't personally feel racist toward black people or people of other races, but they have a hard time getting their brain around like systemic racism. And so as a Christian pastor, part of what I was trying to say in my post was, I think we have an insufficient doctrine of sin. Like, we don't understand that sin doesn't just impact us at an individual level, which is what Benito was describing, but sin can work at systemic levels. It can work in organizations, it can work in power structures. And so if we understand that, and then we think about the history and kind of where we are today, we just can understand that this is not just a person-to-person issue that has to be addressed, but it's also like, how do we create a more just society? And I love your insight, Pastor O, about how it's, in our country, there's specific ways it works out between races. But as I've traveled the world, I've seen the same thing that you have, which is you go out and you see minority races or cultures in all different parts of the world, and they're different depending on where you are, but they all have similar struggles, where it's like there's maybe not the specific issue that you described with African Americans here, but it's like it's mistreatment, or it's struggle with power systems and all this stuff because they're a minority community within a larger community. So that's been kind of eye-opening for me too as I've traveled the world. But so let's go to the third word that we want to talk about, Evan. That's the word injustice, because that is a big issue too. And I think a lot of what, I'll just throw out my opinion, you speak into it. A lot of what people are feeling right now with what's happened in these different cases that are in the news right now, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, then this situation with George Floyd, is not just the terrible acts themselves, that happened, but then what felt like the injustice of how those things were handled. So walk us through, like, what does that word mean when we say we're fighting injustice?
Yeah, when we're talking about injustice, especially in this conversation, it's going to be very similar to the systemic racism. However, When you look at these scenarios that have happened, I've heard many people say, Ahmaud Arbery shouldn't have attacked the guy. The guy was just defending himself. Haven't heard much on the Breonna Taylor because that was a whole different scenario. And then a lot of people with the George Floyd saying, well, let's wait and see all the facts, and we don't know what happened before that and what caused the police officer to do all that. The injustice, when we're talking about it here today, is the difference between how the majority in our country, the white people, are treated and how justice is handed to them versus how it's handed to the minorities. So with Ahmaud Arbery, with George Floyd especially, a lot of the outrage is the justice system not treating those offenders in the same way that the justice system treats other offenders. Mm-hmm. And so that, along with the atrocities of those events, create distrust, creates anger, creates fear. It has a very large impact into people's minds and their souls and their psyches. And so when we talk about injustice in this conversation, we're talking about the inequality of the way that people in our country are policed, the way that they're prosecuted, the way our whole justice system handles these situations.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's good. So let's push into that point a little bit further, and this is a little bit more unscripted. We haven't really talked about this beforehand very much, but why, we know there's a history of these issues. We know there's a history of protest and trying to address these issues, but seems like to me, this is just my eyes speaking, it seems like to me something is different right now, like in the nation as a whole, where this event happens with George Floyd in Minneapolis, and you've got protests breaking out in cities, small, medium, large, all over the nation. That feels different to me, and I guess I want to know why. Like, what's different about this situation? What is happening from your perspective, just kind of in the psyche of the culture right now, that's causing this eruption? What are you perceiving?
I mean, I think the year 2020 has been an interesting year.
For sure.
With the coronavirus and everything, so I just think that mentally and emotionally we're kind of at a boiling point right now. But as it relates to why it seems like things are different now, it goes back to what you said, weary. And we just went through the Ahmaud Arbery situation where he's followed, he's tussles, he's shot and left in the street, but it wasn't until months later, till the video came out, that then now the McMichaels or whatever their name is were arrested, and so it gives a perception that this young man's life really wasn't worth anything until, okay, now the video comes out. Now we have to do something because it's exposed. And so we haven't really got over that yet to now with the George Floyd situation. And when you watch the video, it like rips you apart, because it's like at no point did you ever see him resist. At no point did he become belligerent or using his strength. And to see the cop with his knee on his neck, and for all of those minutes, even after he wasn't moving, it sends a message. It sends a dark message to say it's okay to treat African Americans this way, especially those who are in power. That we're taught not to fight against, not to resist. We shouldn't disobey police officers, but then when the end result is this, even when we do it right, we still, this man now won't ever go back home. His family won't ever be able to experience him again over a issue of a $20 bill, a counterfeit $20 bill. And so people are tired. They were already at a boiling point emotionally with Corona, and then when these two comes out, people are tired. And so they're saying at what point is enough enough? And so the protesting comes from trying to make changes within the system, doing it the right way. The unfortunate actions are the looting and rioting, which from video cameras and different videos that I've seen, is not just African Americans, is all races are doing the rioting and starting it. So, but as you had said before, that we're not supporting the looting and the rioting, but we're supporting the peaceful protest say that we're not just going to sit down and not stand for what's right. Something has to change. Somebody has to be their voice. Somebody has to stand up and say, this is not right, and it has to change.
Yeah.
I think this is also a progression from Ahmaud Arbery to George Floyd, but I think it's also a longer progression. You know, go back to all the different cases, the Trayvon Martin. I was talking with someone in our church the other day, and we were talking about one of the previous instances, and we could not even remember the man's name because there's been so many.
Right.
So as we've been exposed to this, because this is not a new issue, as we've been exposed to this, I think there's been a progression of not even necessarily African American people becoming more vocal or wanting to protest. I think the progression has been the exposure to the white people and white people being able to see the injustices that are happening. And even if they don't understand all the systemic things or even if they're, you know, whatever their experiences are, they're like, this is wrong. And so you start to have this progression and this build from all of us, not all, a lot of us, right?
Yeah.
And I think that leads to a larger protest, a difference, like you said.
Yeah. Thoughts on that, Benito?
Oh, I would just echo what they said, and I think for myself, this buildup and just the one thing is just the inaction of the other officers. That if you're trained and you see somebody on their neck and you, like, how can you be a human being and watch somebody with somebody, knowing that just the amount of pressure. I've heard several people talk about that have martial arts backgrounds. If you hit somebody in the neck right there, you can demobilize them and kill them. And just, that image just has been seared on my mind in not a good way, in a heartbreaking way. And that image, I think, that was caught on camera and they were able to see it, it just resonated in a way that something needs to be done. Like I don't think any other image of something that in the past, I'm sure every other ones, but the way it was caught and all the pictures that were taken, and you see these officers that were absolutely doing nothing about it. I think that stirred up people to, hey, let's do something about this challenge that's taking place.
And the all of that is good and true that you guys are describing. The part that brought me personally to tears, I think too, knowing that George Floyd was just a very large, strong man. And this is just, man-to-man kind of thing. But I think what broke me was hearing him cry out for his mom. I get emotional just talking about it. There's just something in a man that, like, when you're at that point and you're calling out for your mom, I mean, you've been broken, And I don't know if that's, I'm just telling you my reaction to it. I don't know if that broke something in people too, but it did in me, just feeling the weight of that moment. I want to transition a little bit in this conversation to where we go, because I think we've done a good job explaining what we see, what we feel, what's going on, what's happening right now. But I know that a big part of why we're even here today is to say, where do we go from here? Like, to your point, Evan, of saying, okay, this is a kind of ongoing, lingering issue, number of situations that seem to recur. and not sure that things are changing, getting better. So I think part of our heart as pastors is say, okay, if rioting and looting is not the solution, what are the peaceful steps? What are the constructive steps? I've said a few times to people this week is, I don't know how y'all process this. I feel the loss or the lack of a Dr. King right now. Somebody to kind of say, here's the prophetic vision of where we're going, and here's how we're going to mobilize all this energy and passion and zeal to do something constructive and concrete, And I know there are people that are speaking into those things, but as far as a national figure that everybody's looking to go, okay, here's what we do. But I think part of the heart of this conversation with you guys, and y'all know I have a lot of opinions about this, but I want to listen to you guys about, because like you called it courageous keyboard. I call it hashtag activism. Everybody is really bold right now with putting out their statement on social media, which is good. I mean, we don't want to say that's bad. Like, hey, we want to speak up for justice everywhere. But I'm really sensitive to just like, okay, I've posted that thing on social media. We go back to my life and not even think about that issue again. And to me, that's where we get into the situation we're in right now, which is we're not actually moving the needle toward a more just society. And again, we're not saying we haven't progressed. I mean, for sure, there are areas and things that have gotten much better over the last 50 years. But we're saying things are still happening and injustices are still occurring that have to be addressed. And so, talk me through that. Like, what are the concrete, practical, peaceful next steps that actually make a difference?
Yeah, so
Help us out.
There's layers, right? So there's the systemic.
I agree with that.
Actions.
That statement you just said that there's layers. Okay, let me interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Just to illustrate the fact that it's complex. And I think sometimes the complexity of the question I'm asking and the answer to it actually runs people away. Say, well, that's just too hard to understand. It's too hard to figure out how to help.
It's too big.
It's too big, so I'm not going to do anything. And I think part of our passion is saying, no, you can do something, and we ought to give the effort and the energy to understand and listen and participate. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great.
So there's layers.
It's how do you eat an elephant?
That's right.
One bite at a time.
Right.
So there's the systemic actions, which I think we're going to come back to and talk about. But there's personal actions I think that are more clear. How are you seeing people? Mm-hmm. When you see somebody who doesn't look like you, what are your prejudices? Mm-hmm. What are your biases? What are your stereotypes? Mm-hmm. And evaluate them versus how God sees them. And search your heart. And there's going to be repentance that's required there.
That's good.
For all of us.
Preach.
And then from there, there's actionable steps we can take personally inside of our homes, inside of our communities, to not just speak up, but to develop relationship with people who don't look like you. Also, there's a layer that the church is responsible for in this.
Come on.
And the segregation of churches perpetuates all of these problems. Mm-hmm. We should be, as the church, the answer. We should be the solution. We should be the people that right now everybody outside of the church is looking and saying, that's the one place where white, black, Hispanic, Asian get along and they love each other and they worship together. And that is so not the truth and not the case right now in our country. We've allowed Satan to segregate us on Sunday mornings, allowing it to continue to be the most segregated hour in our country with, I mean, this is ridiculous to me. The two most segregated institutions in our country are prisons and churches. Mm-hmm. That's horrible.
Right.
We have to do a better job as spiritual leaders and just as believers in integrating churches. Mm-hmm. And when I say integrating churches, I don't mean all the black people and Hispanic people start going to a white pastor's church. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't mean the majority lead that in a way where they assimilate all of the minorities into their culture. Mm. I mean the church, we should have multi-ethnic churches led by someone who's Hispanic, someone who's African American, someone who's white, all the different ethnicities that are represented, and there's actionable steps to that. And then I think what you really want to get to is the systemic action points, and that's where it gets big, because You have policing, you have prosecution injustices, you have civic opportunities. So I'm really interested in what these guys have as far as the answer to all of that.
I'm probably more of a pessimist when it comes to this because
Okay.
it's hard to change a person's attitude if they've been raised in that most of their life.
Unpack that for me.
Yeah, can I jump in real quick?
yeah,
Can
go
we
ahead.
talk about that?
Let's do it.
So when we talk about addressing systemic issues, what I hear a lot of feedback and pushback is, well, you can't legislate somebody's heart. This idea that if you've been raised like that, that's the way you're going to be. Now, I think if we establish there are people way over here on this side that are racist and their parents are racist and their grandparents are racist and they're all in and they're KKK and they're whatever, like, okay, that's going to take a miracle from God. There are people all the way on this other side that are woke and that are whatever the adjectives are. Like, they're good. Let's talk about the people in the middle. If their hearts are hardened or they can't see people the way God wants to see them, don't we have a responsibility to them? Don't we have a responsibility to the systems that we can impact and change?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And when I say that most likely they won't change, I'm saying that it's harder to move somebody from the far left to the far right or vice versa. Those are in the middle. They have compassion, but maybe they don't really get active in reform or anything like that. I'm saying from the idea and the perception that we can just speak and things will change.
Yeah.
For how many years have we been dealing with this? And we've made strides, and we're now in a generation that is not as oppressive as my grandparents, great-grandparents were living in. But we're still dealing with a situation where a lot of people have been silent as it relates to their racist tendencies, but now they feel empowered to come out and to be boastful about, this is how I feel. I saw it during the presidency of Barack Obama, where, and I followed, presidents of Reagan and Clinton and Bush, and I heard rhetoric that I've never heard from another president, where they called his wife a monkey or actions toward him. And it wasn't, they label it, it's about his policies, but if we're honest, it was about his skin color, because it took so long before we got a first African-American president that it was a shock to the country. It was applauded because majority of the people, finally this has happened. But those who opposed that got emboldened and empowered to say, okay, now we need to speak up, or there's going to be a trend of this, and that's something that we don't want to see. So that's what I'm saying, the solution part of it, I think that there has to be more racial healing, more reform, but it comes from putting people into those positions that have a heart for God and have a heart for Christ, that are opposed to the racial tension that's going on. And unfortunately, we don't have I'm not going to say we don't have a lot, but there are some who are in those positions of judges, police officers, government, that still either they may not be bold with it, but it still resides in them, and it might be a suppressed racism or, where they're just not coming out and saying it, but it's in their heart, and they're not going to make change. They're not going to push the boat. They're not going to be radical in reform. So.
Man,
So, optimist, pessimist, where are you at, Benito?
here's a reality. If we look at that, this issue, and I don't want to go, has been back since the beginning of time.
Right.
Enemy divides.
Yeah,
the
preach.
Spirit of God unites.
Right.
Man, and I don't want to go back to the part of it, but it was Samaritan and Jews. It's the Jews and the Arab. You can broaden it now. It's black and white. It's Hispanic. Whatever it looks like. There is no answer for this outside of the gospel, because this is not a skin issue. It's a sin issue. And unless the Lord changes the heart of a man, nothing's going to change. And that's something that I'm extremely passionate about. I remember being a young man going to church up in Dallas for the first time. I saw African-American church. I saw a white church. I saw a Korean church. And I'm like, why don't we worship together? It's not until we as leaders and we as the church lead the change. Even in Acts chapter 6, I know we're not supposed to go there. When there was some places that injustices were taking place within the church, it was the church that answered the bell and that said, okay, hey, these widows are not being treated rightly, so let's do the right thing and let's change it. Again, in Acts 11, as the church fathers are coming against, and the early church is coming against Peter, said he can't take it to the Gentiles. It was the church that led the way. And if we as the church do not lead the change, it is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because reality, you can put laws into place. Just as you legislated morality, and when Constantine in 323 became the emperor of Rome, he says, let's make Christianity universal Christianity. It imploded in our face. But it's the power of the church. And I know we're talking about policies and everything, but if we can become alive, active churches that realize, wow, and I'll talk, you said we'll talk about this later. How does this happen? It happens when we see, Lord, I'm the answer to this problem. And I'm going to take responsibility for this. And I'm going to love others. And it makes how we view the world differently, how we view each other differently. And the gospel not only changes relationships and makes us right with God, but it also changes how we view the world. It comes to another man's world and says, hey, Pastor O, what are you feeling, man? Like Jesus came. Man, I've never been there. I didn't grow up like you grew up, but Jesus came close. I want to come close to you. And Keith, what does it look like when you and just it's coming close to each other? And I know we're talking about
social distancing.
Yeah, I know. My bad. Yeah, but that's just.
I agree with you.
But those are some things that as we look at it, I understand that there's some practical things that we can put into place. But unless we deal with the heart issue, we're going to be replaying this. Let's be honest. It's been since the beginning of time.
Right. And
only the gospel changes it.
Yeah.
Can I amen that? Can I add a little something to that?
I was going to disagree with him, but go ahead.
Well, let me amen it before you disagree,
Okay.
because once you disagree, I don't know that I'll still have my amen.
Keep going.
So Benito, I agree with you 100%. From Genesis to Revelation, you see God's heart and desire for people of all ethnicities to come together and be unified. In Genesis 11, when you're talking about the Tower of Babel, they were so unified that God said the power was there and nothing was impossible to them, even though they were in opposition to God. The examples you gave in Acts, you go through and read much of what Paul writes, and Paul writes about the miracle and the mystery of Jews and Gentiles worshiping the same God and being connected. In John 17, when Jesus prayed right before he leaves the earth, he prays, and the whole prayer is about unity, that believers would be unified just as him and his Father are. So the power of God is in unity. And what Satan has done is he's divided us, and we don't see the power. So we're searching for answers when the answers are found somewhere in this unity and the integration specifically of us worshiping together. One of the books that you recommended to me when pretty close on when we first met, Keith, was Divided by Faith, and how the segregation of churches impacts our view on race, our view on politics, and all of that. You could probably speak way better to that than I could, but it's vital that the church becomes who God created the church to be, which is an integrated church.
Yeah, for sure. And part of that is if you don't know people at a personal level, if you don't have friends of different races that you're actually listening to, and this is why being in a congregation of people of different races is so important, is because your brothers and sisters in Christ So that brings that unity. And then you've got the diversity of your experiences and what you've walked through, and you listen to each other. That just makes us more aware of like, okay, here's how I can help. Here's what I can do in the world to make a difference. And when I say I'm disagreeing with you, I don't disagree at all with what you're saying about like laws. I think when we say you can't legislate morality, what we mean by that is laws don't change people's hearts. You can write a law and people can still disobey the law because that doesn't have the power. As we know, even looking at the Old Testament, the law of God given, 10 commandments, here's what God wants you to do. And then what's the whole point of the scriptures? We can't do it, right? And Jesus had to come and do it for us. And so the law itself is unable to change the human heart. Agreed. However, what we don't mean when we say you can't legislate morality is laws don't matter. And what we don't mean is, this is where I was going to disagree with you a little bit, and really not disagree, is just kind of add to what you're saying, which is we do legislate morality all the time. Like we do have laws that say you can't kill somebody. That's why this whole conversation about like the law applied to this police officer who killed George Floyd, right? Like there is a law that says you can't murder another human being. And if you do that, there's consequences that come from that. And we feel the injustice when, hey, there's a law, but it's not being applied, in the correct way or the right way or whatever. And we'll get into that conversation in a minute. But all I'm saying is yes, and I think this is where especially we over-individualize the gospel and we over-individualize this race conversation, which is say, I've got a Hispanic friend or a black friend or a white friend, and I listen to them, and I don't hate them, and I work with them, and we get along fine. Or I've got somebody of a different race in my family, and we get along great. And, we over-individualize it, and we say because of those relationships, racism's not a problem. And all I'm saying is, that's an insufficient way to look at the issue, which is when we individualize all these conversations and say it does start with the human heart, but part of the human heart change, part of what the gospel does is the empathy piece, which is to say your experience is different from my experience, and I'm going to learn and I'm going to listen, and then I'm going to help.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. Righteousness exalts a nation, sin brings a reproach, right? And what I'm saying is it's a spiritual, even you have these laws in place, and some of these laws are in place, they're still being broken. And that's that's why I say we can put these laws in place, but the heart needs to change. And just to share what you say, and this is where I agree with you. This is one of the things that I think we struggle in America. We're an independent culture. We're individualistic. Our Declaration of Independence. And that's really opposed to how the gospel is really taught throughout the scriptures. And this is where I 100% concur. And let me add something.
Communal?
Yeah, it's absolutely communal because God begins to hold a whole community accountable. Like if you do not understand it, because I think it's like a fish in water, right? We don't really have a great understanding of reading the Bible. Like we'll come to some places in Joshua 7 where God judges an entire nation because of one man's sin, Achan. And then we see the book of Daniel where the entire nation is brought into captivity, even when they're godly and righteous people. So there is this systemic sin of racism. And then Romans 5, Paul talks to us about how we need to deal with these issues. And if we don't deal with these issues, that's why I say it starts with the church. And if the church begins to deal with these issues and begins to speak into these issues, because all of a sudden, these systemic issues begin to affect all of the community. And that's where we're at. I don't ever think as Americans, we have ever repented of our racism and said, Lord, look what we did. Look how we unjustly treated the African Americans and where I'm from, the Native Americans as well. So there's a lot of some of the most oppressed people in the world, some of my friends that I went to school, because there were some pueblos and what was done to them was atrocities that was totally horrible. And we need to come together and we need to say, Lord, I'm sorry. And you say, I hear people tell me all the time, like, how can we be sorry for it? I didn't do it. Well, God doesn't look at it like that. He holds a whole community accountable for their actions. And I see that throughout Scripture.
Yeah, and that's back to my point of not just sin being individualized, but being communal. Yeah. Because that's the point you're making, too, is we kind of have a category for personal repentance. Okay, I did this wrong. I'm sorry I did it. God, please forgive me. Change my heart, right? But do we even have a category for communal repentance? We did this. I mean, that's why I hear you saying.
Yeah, exactly.
100% agree. Like we just don't have that category. As Americans, I think we really struggle with that. Yeah. Oh, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, and I think when you take a look at the word community, it's different because there used to be a time where one particular culture, race stayed in one community, another particular race and culture stayed in another. When you go back to Jesus's time, you know, the Jews was in one situation, and they go across the sea to preach to the Gentiles. Well, now when the communities are coming together, and now you have different ethnicities and different cultures staying next door to you, now you have to deal with that directly rather than indirectly. And like you said, a lot of times we can sit back and say, hey, you know, like you said, I got black friends, I have white friends, I have Hispanic. I'm not a racist. I'm good. I've done my part. But being able to relate to what the other side is going through, and Evan alluded to that. My son is 15, and my son is almost as tall as me, and so how do you have those conversations with him to say, you need to be careful every time you go out? If a cop stops you, do everything that he says to do in order to make it out alive. But then what they're seeing is sometimes even that doesn't work. And so we're having to have these conversations with our sons and daughters, that those conversations really didn't really happen so much when I was growing up, but they did. But we're living in a time now to where, hey, I can come live next to you, Keith. I can live next to you. I can live next to Benito. But then in that neighborhood, in that community, are we still dealing with the racism? And so it's the weariness. Even this past Sunday, I had another sermon planned out, but I literally had to address what's going on, because the people want to know, where's God in this? What is God saying in this? Because we want to act toward the way that the gospel is telling us to act. And so that's where the pastors come in, is how do we speak to the situation to help our people understand what's going on? And it's different with the different congregations. I'm having to preach, don't be angry, or there's acceptable anger that the Bible speaks of, and not the other side of anger. Or don't be tired, don't be weary. God can turn the situation around, trusting God. And the unfortunate reality is that there's a lot of people who are saying, hey, the gospel is not working. We've tried it, and it's still not working. So now we want to take measures into our own hand, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
But how do we get people back, and how do you get people to say, you know, look, the children of Israel was in bondage for 400 years, and God delivered. It's in His timing, but people are just fed up, and people are tired.
It's really good. It's not good what you're describing. It's a good explanation. It's helpful. I think where I'd like to go right now is to kind of touch on what are those systemic solutions, because I think part of what you're describing, it is a hard issue. It is a church first issue. It is a personal issue of how we treat one another, love each other, all of that. But if it is a systemic issue also, which not everybody agrees with that, I'm convinced, but not everybody is, I'm just acknowledging it out loud, then what are the systemic solutions? And this is what I want to kind of throw out. I posted this morning, and this is kind of my theory, and I want to float it by you guys and let you interact with it a little bit, is that I feel like in the evangelical church, we've done a pretty good job on the pro-life issue, creating kind of a roadmap for people. Okay, if we care about life, specifically unborn life, and we don't want to see unborn children aborted, and we want to see more of these babies born, how do we create a more pro-life culture? Okay, so that's the question. And I feel like if I was to ask most people that are involved in a Bible-believing church, they would have a pretty good answer to that question. Here's the roadmap. Okay, we need to vote pro-life. We need to advocate for support, pro-life judges. That's been a huge issue for years and years I've heard about, pro-life judges. We need pro-life legislation, within the state legislatures where a lot of this happens. We need to support financially, pregnancy centers who are on the front lines of working with unplanned pregnancies and supporting young pregnant women. We need to get involved in foster care and adoption, the whole thing. I think a lot of people, they may not be able to articulate it as clearly as I just articulated it, but even as I'm saying it, you're nodding your head like, oh yeah, I've heard those things. That makes sense. A lot of people would know part of that. Our churches have all been involved in some part of that equation. I know that we have here at Cityview. But if I was to ask this question, what is the parallel pro-justice roadmap, right? Like I got the pro-life roadmap clear. I understand it. Been working on it for decades. What's the parallel for a person who says, I really do care about us having a more just society and people not experiencing racism, injustice, inequality. I care about that issue. I'm passionate about it. What do I do? And I feel like pastorally, this is where I feel like as pastors, yes, we preach the gospel. Yes, we speak to the human heart. Yes, we model for people. Yes to all of that. And a piece I think has been missing, which is here's the roadmap for if you want to make a difference in the larger society and making this a more just community, here's what you do. And honestly, it's taken me years to even be able to articulate what I just said to you. And then even more time to think through what are the pieces that would even be a part of that roadmap. Partly because my experience with that whole list that makes up the justice system has been one experience that's very different from like what Pastor O you're articulating or Evan you're saying, hey, this is what I hear in my congregation. It's very different. And those pieces, there's probably at least 20. I'll just give you 6 big ones. There's politicians. All of it is wrapped up in our representative political system. Hardly anything in our culture happens if we're not vocal to politicians and saying, hey, this needs to change. There's politicians, there's laws that are written, laws that are enforced. There's law enforcement agencies, so those who investigate crimes are charged with, empowered to enforce the laws that have been written. You've got prosecutors, you've got local district county attorneys who many people probably don't even know are elected officials whose job is to prosecute what the police brings to them as far as what crimes have been committed. Then on top of the prosecutors, you've got judges who hear cases, supposed to be impartial, ruling over these cases. Then you've got prison systems and the penal system. So that's just 6 big pieces. There's probably 10 more. But I think even as I articulate that, as I've tried to explain it, personally, I felt overwhelmed. Like, man, that is a lot. That is complex. There's all these moving pieces. Injustice can break down at any part within the system for any reason, for any person, all of that. So in some ways, I don't know if this describes some of the weariness or some of the hopelessness of like, you know what, we've been trying to address these little things here or there, but man, that whole thing seems so large and complex, and we don't even know where to start. And I think part of our job as pastors is to say, and this is why my blog post ended up being forever long, because if you take those, I think the 3 issues we've just had recently between Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and then with George Floyd, I actually think a different part of the system broke down in each one of those cases, which is also why it is the visuals and the emotions of it, but then it's also just this feeling of overwhelming. It's like, well, that seemed to be the prosecutor, this seemed to be a policy, this seemed to be the police, and then it's like, okay, like how do you, I'm grieving, but I don't even know which one of those 3 to kind of deal with, and so then I think it just turns into protesting, like we just have to, something has to change. But I feel like as pastors, part of it is as we're preaching the gospel, discipling people, building more multi-ethnic communities, I also feel this burden that we have to begin to teach our people. You're not going to be able to work in all 6 of those areas I just described, but you can get involved in one of them. You could say, hey, this is the one that I'm most passionate about, I feel called to work on, and here's how I can get involved. So I want to talk about that here in a second, but I do want to take a break. So we're going to kind of pause here at the end of part one. We need to take a bathroom break and kind of reset here for a minute. And then I want to come back and ask you guys what you think about what I just said, and y'all push back on me a little bit.